So what I'd like to focus on today is evaluating the claims, the competing claims and narratives coming from, say, the Gambia when they brought the case against Myanmar and the charges of genocide at the International Court of Justice, as well as Aung San Suu Kyi's response to those claims and how she tries to refute them. And this is work with, I'll be clear, that involves collecting a lot of data. And in fact, I should thank the British government as well, DFID, or whatever it's called now, FCDO. So DFID was very generous in supporting a lot of our data collection in the Rohingya refugee camps in southern Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar district. Okay, with that, so the setting is that the Gambia brought a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice with a claim of genocide against the Rohingya, right? And their claim is that Tatmadaw, which is a general term for the Myanmar security forces involving the military, the police, right? And they have engaged in widespread systematic violence and clearance operations, and they've used the word like genocidal acts. Okay? And a lot of this is based on some of the fact-finding missions that the UN and UNHCR have conducted. And so UNHCR also uses similar language that the actions of the Myanmar military negatively affects the Rohingyas' right to existence. Okay, so these are serious charges. Now, the reaction from the Myanmar side, the defense from the Myanmar side, Aung San Suu Kyi visited the ICJ to present Myanmar's case. The reaction uses very specific language I want to highlight that I have in blue here. Okay, that her claim is that, look, these charges are serious, but they're based on very specific testimonies, individual testimonies, and narratives, so very qualitative narratives, right? It's not systematic. This is not systematic data or evidence, right? And the entire narrative is quite precarious. It depends on specific statements made by refugees in camps where they might have an incentive to exaggerate, right, or provide inaccurate information because they're claiming to be victims. Okay? So and to be fair, that is a reasonable and fair response. And the reason is that, if you're going to make important charges and such serious charges, we really do need to back it up with evidence. Okay, so we find ourselves in a situation where the charges are serious. There are some competing narratives. People are telling two different stories, right? And the question for us, so with my co-authors, Austin Davis, who's at American University, Jaya Wen, who's at Harvard Business School, and Paula Lopez Pena, who's a postdoc at Yale University, we are trying to gather systematic data and generate systematic evidence to see which of these narratives actually plays out in the data. Okay, so what do we bring to the table? So first of all, large representative sample of data. So there's two key pieces of data, and we'll merge other things as well. So one key piece is a comprehensive accounting of all conflict events across all of Myanmar from 2010 till today, till 2020, for the last 10 years. So we observe every single conflict, who started it, what was the reaction, what were the fatalities on each side, and not just conflict against the Rohingya, but conflict in Rakhine State in general. There's other conflicts, the conflicts in Kachin. So there's other states in Myanmar where there's also a lot of ethnic conflict going on. And so that allows us to look at how, what's happening in the Rohingya areas, what are the determinants, systematic determinants of the conflict in Rakhine State, especially in Rohingya villages, and whether that is similar to or different from conflicts that happen elsewhere in Myanmar. Okay? So that's one. And then to look at the consequences of the conflict, instead of relying on individual narratives that are handpicked, we instead collect, we first do a full accounting, that forced us to go in and have touch points with 55,000 people living in and around the camps in Cox's Bazar, and chose to, in a statistically representative way, in partnership with the World Bank and other research partners, a sample of 5,000 refugees and host communities, so members living nearby, Bangladeshis living nearby, to try and systematically account for the effects on their lives today in terms of economic effects, but also trauma and psychological effects. Okay? And so we collect all this data and we conduct rigorous statistical analysis on the data in order to uh, try and uncover three separate sets of findings. Okay, so the first thing we do is by combining this violence data with economic data, we find that there is some systematic economic motivation behind the violence. So this narrative that the Buddhists live in fear and they're just responding to the fear of Rohingya attacks, that doesn't seem right. Okay? Second, when we look at the nature of the conflict against the Rohingya relative to conflicts against other ethnic groups in Myanmar, the violence against the Rohingya appears to be fundamentally different. The reactions are strong and disproportionate. There's a lot more fatalities, especially targeting civilians in Rohingya, and that's not true of other conflicts in Myanmar. Okay, and third, by examining our data collected in Cox's Bazar at the refugee camps in depth, we find severe trauma, health, and economic consequences. The Rohingya have lost a lot, both in terms of assets, which relates back to the fact that there is economic motivations for this violence, and they've also lost a lot in terms of their mental and physical well-being, right? Which will, according to merging this with other research, which should make them much less productive later in life. Okay, so how do we get at the economic drivers of conflict? So here we now merge all of the conflict data with data put together in Rome by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, right? Where what they do is they examine the details of the quality of land and the wetlands and how much precipitation there is, etc., in order to create a map of essentially the entire world that tells us about how suitable is this particular location for rice growing. And that's the black versus gray and lighter colors that you see in the background. And I've just overlaid a map of Myanmar in homing in on this particular area. So you see in Myanmar, there's going to be some areas that are very, very suitable for rice growing and other areas that are not so suitable. And this is in Rakhine State. And why focus on rice? It's the dominant agricultural product for Myanmar. It's a dominant agricultural product in Rakhine State in particular, right? And it's a staple for all Burmese people. And it's also the case that both the land and the crop can be appropriated, right? So if there's going to be some systematic economic determinants and motivations behind this conflict, it's likely related to rice because that's what's grown there and that's what produces economic value. Okay. And so how do you determine value? It depends on two things. So how suitable is this land for rice growing? And second, during periods of during years when rice prices are high internationally, right? Those are periods when the motives to appropriate that land and that crop is particularly strong, right? So then we end up asking the question, do we observe increases in conflict in rice growing areas relative to other areas, especially during periods when international rice prices are high, when stealing and appropriating the land and the crop becomes more attractive for perpetrators of conflict, okay? And the reason to examine this is based on, Aung San Suu Kyi's narrative, where, she instead claims, it's not systematic, it's not economically motivated, there's fear on both sides. This was reminiscent of, Mr. Trump's statements about good people on both sides as well. And her claim is that this is in an interview in the BBC and also reported in the New York Times, that Buddhists live in fear of a global Muslim power, and that's what's driving the conflict, okay? And instead we inquire in the data, are there economic motivations or is it really what she's claiming, which is a response to fear, okay? And the answer is the economic motivations are quite clear. Right? So when and where rice is valuable, right? That's what we have plotted here. Like there are areas areas and time periods when rice is not very valuable and areas and time periods when it is, right? That's on the x-axis. What you find is that violence against civilians increases when and where rice is valuable. Violence against civilians by the military, by the Tatmadaw increases, right? And looting and property damage increases as well. And to be clear, this is true for, this type of economic motivation is true for violence and conflicts all over Myanmar. But it's also true, even though we have a much smaller sample to examine this, it's also apparent in Rakhine State in particular, where the Rohingya reside. Okay, and so this is consistent with rapacity, consistent with systematic violent appropriation by the state. Okay? Second thing we'll do is look at using a set of impulse response functions. What happens when the Rohingya initiate some conflict? Okay, so we're going to take the sort of the worst case scenario, which is a Rohingya militia initiates a conflict, right? So we start on day one, right? We're just plotting the data. On day one is when we've normalized things. So on day one, the Rohingya militia had initiated something. Okay, so after that happens, their violence dies down pretty quickly, right? But this is what happens to Tatmadaw responses, right? So that particular day, in response to a Rohingya initiated event, there's a disproportionate increase in Tatmadaw initiated events, and that's true. That stays true for several days afterwards. It's quite a few interventions in response. So there's a disproportionate use of force against the Rohingya, right? So you might find, maybe perhaps this is natural. The military should, needs to stamp this out very quickly. But however, when you compare this to any other events in Myanmar, so say when a Kachin militia intervention starts, what you observe is that the Tatmadaw's response is exactly proportionate, right? So this is true for Kachin. This is also true for Rakhine militia intervention. So there's yet another, now we're focusing on the same state, but a different conflict. Unlike the Rohingya case, there's a proportionate response for pretty much all other conflicts involving other ethnic groups other than the Rohingya. So the Rohingya are being treated very differently in Myanmar relative to how they're dealing with any other conflict. Okay? And I should also say that this is not only about the Tatmadaw initiating conflict events, right? When you look at fatalities, so if there are, when this first event leads to say 10 fatalities caused by the Rohingya militia intervention, so fatalities for the Rohingya go up several-fold, right? And it continues for several days afterwards. Okay, and finally, what happens now when the refugees are sent over to Bangladesh, and how do they, sort of how do they, what are their systematic, large sample narratives about the effects of the crisis that they escaped? Okay. So this is based on this large scale representative surveys. And what you find is large numbers of people. It's not just isolated incidents. It's not like narratives built on, precariously built on one or two stories that might have been exaggerated, right? Over 50% of the refugees report having near-death experiences, close to death experiences. Over 50% observe the murder of strangers, right? And just over 40% observe murders of families and friends, right? Many have forced family separation, forced isolation, etc. Okay. And beyond the health consequences, right? It's also the case that these traumatic experiences then lead to depression, right? Mental health issues. So you see that 39% of women, Rohingya women, report these. We administered the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, an international, systematic study of identifying, symptoms of depression. So you see this, the rate is 39% among Rohingya women, 24% among Rohingya males, right? Relative to, say, the US general population of 8%, residents of Fukushima 1 year after the nuclear disaster of 12%, Syrian refugees who arrived in Germany in 2014 of 13%, right? And it's also, I should also point out that there's a lot of trauma also among Bangladeshi natives who live nearby. All right, and then finally, the economic outcomes. So these are distributions of incomes across three populations. The camp population, Rohingyas, Bangladeshis who live near the camps, Bangladeshis who live further away from the camps. So this I'm showing, speaking more to my Bangladeshi compatriots in terms of how we're now treating the Rohingya. So the point here is that when you look at these three distributions, they're right on top of each other. In terms of income levels, the Rohingya who came from the other side of the Naf River, they look just like the Bangladeshis did on this side of the river, okay? And it's just the bad luck of being born in the wrong side of the river that caused this huge loss, right? So what's happened after July 2017 is that, of course, this is the pre-July 2017 distribution. This is post. And the Rohingya incomes and assets move sharply to the left. And they've lost a lot of assets. So they used to, in fact, have more land per capita than Bangladeshis do in Cox's Bazar, right? But they've lost all of that. So just to wrap up, what we are seeing evidence of in this large sample data is that there's systematic patterns of violence. It's not about both sides. There's fear, a clear pattern of events cannot be established, etc. And the violence is disproportionate, especially against the Rohingya, relative to every other conflict in Myanmar. There's more fatalities than whatever was initiated, and it's also targeting civilians, Rohingya civilians. And it's caused grave harm, both in terms of economic effects as well as mental health and depression effects. And I'll stop there. Thank you.